Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going to be going through a tier list of the heavy vehicles available in Star Wars Legion. So as mentioned in the previous video, going to be carrying on with the sort of tier list series I've been doing up until now. Not got many left, and today we're going to be talking about the heavy vehicle slot. Again, just to run through the tier list for anybody who sort of hasn't watched these videos before. D tier is essentially, even in its best situation in game, it's still very weak, and in its worst situation it's essentially unusable and maybe not like actively detrimental to your army, but as a result of spending points on it, it basically makes your list worse. C tier is sort of kind of the next tier up, obviously, and in its best situation, a C tier unit might be like fairly good. It might offer something maybe the rest of your army can't, but maybe not do it very consistently or very well. Or kind of in its average situation, it's bad and kind of not going to be that impactful on the game. These also might be units that are maybe a bit overcosted, and while they might be sort of powerful in a way, just because their points are so high, it means they might not be sort of very strong in game. B tier is average units, so these are what you'll tend to see at kind of maybe like the bottom end of competitive lists, and it might be that you're kind of maybe forced to take these, or you're not a huge fan of taking them, but on average they're going to be okay, and actually situationally they might be quite good. So in specific scenarios they might be sort of close to maybe an A tier or an S tier unit, but maybe those scenarios don't occur super often. A tier is when a unit is consistently good or impactful. It might also be very good value for points. And even when it's not in its sort of ideal situation, it's still not a bad unit. It might still have something to offer and can maybe offer a bit of flexibility in that regard. And then S tier is a unit that either is like situationally incredibly strong and game winning, or just in general very powerful and will kind of offer something to the rest of your list. Maybe it's very points efficient, or maybe it can buff up surrounding units and make them more impactful. But yeah, without further ado, we're going to get into ranking some units. So to start off with, the first unit we're going to be looking at is the LAAT, the L-A-A-T. This is available in GAR and in Empire, and recently saw a bit of a points buff. I think it came down by 10 points from 105 to 95. And I think I'm going to be cautious of saying this unit's underrated because I think it's quite bad. But what it can offer is basically a fairly tough transport unit that can sit on objectives when it needs to. Like 8 health with white surging defense die, armor 5, and the ability to avoid blast, melee, and range 1 weapons is kind of useful. Obviously, there are certain lists, like I'm thinking AATs, land speeders, that are just going to chew straight through this, and especially against like large dice pools as well that consistently get over the top of armor 5, this will probably go down fairly quickly. But with transport and with the fact that it can, obviously with its sort of hover air and things like that, it can maneuver in quite a weird way. Couple that with the fact it has a very large base, it can be sort of surprisingly quick. And, Arsenal 2 isn't the worst. Like, you can take the armaments options on these. You're probably taking like high velocity shells, for instance. Yeah, I don't know. It's like I've said in the description here. It's a bit of a confusing unit. It makes me feel a bit like kind of Crabs did in the last one, where I'm not quite sure what it's trying to do, and it doesn't do anything that well. So I think it kind of sums up a C tier unit pretty well. Thanks to the buff, I think it probably just sits above D tier. Like, I don't think it's like actively completely dragging your list down by putting this in. Couple that with the fact that the Empire heavy slot isn't super competitive, I think that probably helps it maybe just get a little bit better. But it can play objectives against certain lists, like if they've tooled up with like nades, for instance, like the impact grenades, and if maybe they've got force user and things like that, you can negate those. So there are some options there. But as I've said here, I would like to see it get a couple of buffs, like just give it surge to hit, give it maybe some heavy cover, things like that. Yeah, I don't know. It's a weird one, and I don't think it deserves to be D tier, but I think it is clinging on by its fingertips to being C tier. Next one we're going to be talking about is the Gav tank, and I feel like all this needs is just a bit of a points change and maybe giving it surge to hit. And I think that would then pretty much fix this unit. It's another strange one. Like, I think all these C tier units, I'm just going to end up saying the word strange quite a lot, because in the old version of the game, I don't think it was like oppressive or anything. It was just fairly good. But I think they have overvalued transport here a bit, and yes, it does have quite a big base, so it does enable you to maybe jump up the board a bit. But yeah, I mean, it's again in that kind of slightly confusing role of it doesn't do enough damage to be an outright kind of like damage threat. Like even with the Arsenal 2, and if you're taking the Hammers pilot and one of the heavies, for instance, like you're probably only hitting for maybe 4 or 5, and that's with not that many exciting keywords behind it. You know, it's not like the AAT that gets you high velocity, or the land speeder that can offer ion, or even the saber tank that can offer beam. Like this just doesn't have any of those kind of special things. And 8 health is nice with those red saves and the armor 5. Like it is decent, but you do feel it compared to, say, I don't know, the AAT or the saber with that 9 red health. I think it is just that step up. And yeah, I don't know. It's a shame because the model is quite cool, and it was always kind of fun to have, like in the previous version of the game, you could put like, I don't know, emplacement trooper inside and then just run around with them shooting out, and that was always quite fun. But I kind of obviously I get why they've made the transport changes. But yeah, I think the problem with the Gav is it it's worse than the ATST, and they are in a very similar kind of role. Like it's not like the Gav offers loads of support options and things like that. The ATST kind of covers all of those. So then you're just never really taking the Gav over the ATST currently. And given the fact that the Gav is only 20 points less than the ATST and just clearly not as good, it is a bit of a shame. But yeah, like there are things you can do with transport. Like, you know, you could stick, I've said here, you could fit a full squad of riots in there, for instance. That could be quite fun. Or death troopers could be another option if you want to get them onto the board quickly and then use your aim shoot and things like that. Like there are options, and you know, if it wants to sit back and just fire at range 4, it can do that. But I think just the versatility and the sort of the greater breadth of options you have on the ATST probably just make it worth taking. So yeah, a confusing one. And you know, you're leaning on those red saves, and sometimes those red saves will make you feel invincible, and sometimes they're just going to completely blank on you, and that's just the luck of the draw, unfortunately. So another one in C tier that's just a bit strange, and I don't think it deserves to be D tier, but also I just don't think it would kind of fit into a competitive list. I don't think it has a clear enough role, and I don't think in the kind of scenarios where it is good, it's good enough to justify being any higher than C tier. Moving up to the next unit in C tier, it's going to be the Rebel Airspeeder. Now, I kind of ummed and ahed about these for a bit, and I think they are a fairly good unit, is the way I would sum these up. The problem is that in order to be good, they have to be used really well, and even when they're used really well, I don't think they're that good. I think they're surprisingly good against armor. I will say that, like having run like especially like land speeders into these, for instance, that surge to crit and the impact 3 can be surprisingly good. The weakness is that it's only range 3. I think if it was range 4, it would give it more options. And then the other part is it has Arsenal 2, but to get the value from Arsenal 2, you have to be firing out of the back arc as well. And lining up the front and the back means you sort of have to be going almost like perpendicular to where like most of the units are planning to come. So it's a bit weird. Couple that with the fact that it's still too expensive. Like I think it comes in at 130 points now. 125, so slightly cheaper than I thought it was going to be, but still very expensive. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't really know what the sort of the fixes would be. Like I've said here, I think cover 2 is an option. I don't know if there are any units with armor 4, but I think armor 4 could be potentially quite interesting. Obviously, it doesn't need any help with objectives. It's speed 3 with a big base. It's going to fly across the board, so I think that's fine. But I do just think like a few little bits, like you could consider giving this red saves. That might just give it a bit more, but then maybe it becomes a little bit tough. I don't know. It's a really weird unit, and I just it is again too expensive, and maybe just doesn't quite have the output to merit being 100 and sort of, well, it'd be 125, and then I guess if you're taking probably strike and fade on this, I don't know if you need strike and fade, but yeah, it's probably coming in around 130 points. So yeah, it's another one that's just a bit weird, and I think the problem is with that armor 3, if somebody tries to focus you down, especially if they've got anti-armor tech, as soon as you're forcing like multiple white saves, this thing's just going to explode. And they're very difficult to hide because of their like flying base and things like that. Like I think that is a nerf that is worth noting with these units that have like the LAT and the Wookiee Fluttercraft, because they are higher up. It means you can't hide them as easily, and that does present sort of challenges versus the normal speeder bikes. Like even the land speeder, for instance, is very low, and that enables it if you want it to. If you're coming onto the board before a big target or something that might shoot you back, it does give you the option to hide, whereas this just doesn't have that. So it's a weird one. It is a fun unit, and when I've played into them, they have been quite fun games, but also they've died by like turn 3, so maybe limited amounts of fun to be had. But yeah, definitely an interesting unit, and I think quite a classic C-tier unit. And the final unit in C-tier is going to be the AA5 Speeder Truck. This is in Shadow Collective and in Rebels. I think before the points change, this probably would have been a low B tier unit, but after the points change, I think it is a C tier unit. I think it's just knocked it down from maybe low B tier into high C tier. So it's fairly tough, the 8 white health with the armor 5. We've already seen the kind of LAT that offers that, and sort of the airspeed, although slightly different, obviously. Basically, they added 10 points to the base unit and then knocked a bunch of points off of all the guns to kind of incentivize taking those guns. And I really disliked that change because I was not running my AA5s with the gun. I would normally, where I took them most often was in kind of an Ahsoka list, where sometimes I took like Shriv and an Orthodox Tactician, so that you could, on the Ahsoka Sabine synergy turn, or if you had a Leia and Wicket knocking around as well, you could fire off loads of aims and dodges, and it felt really good. But now that unit probably comes in close to 100 points, and that just feels kind of crazy when that's kind of land speeder points, and you just shouldn't, if you're making a competitive list, you shouldn't be running a land speeder over the AA5, in my opinion. But yeah, aside from that, it's just a very straightforward vehicle. The transport is nice on that big base. Again, kind of said a similar thing with the Gav tank and actually with the LAT as well. Like you can jump units pretty far up the board. It's roughly equivalent to kind of like Scout 3, Scout 4, depending on how you kind of assess those things. But yeah, it's not bad. Obviously, you can take the medic on it, which is nice in certain lists. In a Shadow Collective list with a bunch of Mandos, that can be fairly decent. But again, they've added 10 points to taking that version of the truck, so it just doesn't feel quite as good. But as I've said here, again, like the other units in C tier, I think this is less weird. I think this is a lot more kind of straightforward and has a clearer role, but it's now just been made weaker in that sort of specific role that it does have, and I think that just makes it a lot less compelling. So still a perfectly solid unit, just again, not quite in that kind of competitive realm that you're going to see with sort of the units that do sit in higher tiers. Moving up to the bottom of B tier, and it's going to be the Saber Tank. I think it's slightly overcosted, so coming in at 155 points. I think it could be the same or cheaper than the AAT, and I think it'll be absolutely fine. One of the exciting things about this one is it is available in the 212th Legion, which was recently released, and in that unit critically, you are able to get access to sort of surges and share them between vehicles, and that can be absolutely huge, especially if you're planning to run 1, 2, or maybe even 3 Saber classes. If you can get hold of defensive surges, thanks to, I can't remember which of the pilots it is, might be the elite core pilot or something that gives it defensive surges, but getting a surge or two on this can be an absolutely huge deal and make it that bit more survivable. In terms of its keywords, obviously Armor 5 is great, Arsenal 2 is pretty good, Hover Ground is meh. Outmaneuver is, if you had Outmaneuver and Nimble, then we would be kind of talking. But yeah, just regular Outmaneuver is okay, but not normally kind of worth building around. Weak point, rear and sides means that generally you're going to be hitting a weak point. The rear and the sides are a huge amount of it, although you will try and stay a bit front on thanks to heavy laser cannons. So maybe you can mitigate that a bit, but generally if your opponent wants to, they will be able to get that extra impact from the weak point in the sides. Yeah, another thing about this that kind of has surprised me, having played into it a couple of times recently, thanks to the sort of 212th Legion coming out, is that it's surprisingly low profile, which is good and it's bad. Makes it easier to hide, but also means it can get like weirdly stuck sometimes. And if you don't sort of think about where you're planning to end up with terrain, like if you have to waste an action pivoting and then moving with this, that's absolutely huge. So kind of playing around terrain where you find it is really important with this, and I think can be a little bit frustrating to deal with. But yeah, I think the Saber class is close, but just not that compelling. And I think crucially, it will probably struggle to make its points back over the course of a game. And weirdly, something about this, it does just seem to die quite quickly. And I don't know whether that's just because it is a really obvious target to go for, and maybe, I do tend to run a land speeder or two in my lists, but something about the red saves on this just don't seem to hold up that well. No idea what it is. It's more a conspiracy theory than anything else, but it's a solid piece, and you're normally taking, I don't know, high velocity shells on it, for instance, so your rangeful dice pool can be pretty good. And then if you're taking like the beam turret, for instance, that can give you some nice kind of AoE against lists where that's going to be relevant. So it does have some nice tools, but again, if you are fully tooling up, this can probably go up to like 180 points, which is, that's pushing into good force user territory and things like that. It is a bit crazy how expensive this can end up being, and it just doesn't feel that proactive and that damaging on the field. So yeah, unfortunately, I think it is at the bottom end of B tier, but I think if you do want to try and stick this in a more competitive list, especially with the advent of the 212th Legion, I think that's not a terrible idea. And the next one we're going to be talking about, again, quite a similar and sort of classic vehicle in this slot, is going to be the AT-ST. And I really like the AT-ST. I think it's a really well balanced and designed unit. I think it feels like it should. As I've said here, it's not meta. I don't know if it needs a buff or anything. Again, like, you can do things like, giving it surge to hit, for instance, or giving it critical on its main gun and things like that are options. But I don't think it needs any of that. I think it's kind of fine as it is. One thing about this is that 11 white health can sometimes just absolutely die on you. And anybody who's played like an AA5, for instance, as soon as you're rolling like lots of white defense die, sometimes you roll 6 and you see all blank, and then suddenly your AT-ST has gone from 11 health to 5, and it's like, oh, okay, so we're in trouble now. And yeah, you are just leaning on those white saves, and again, it's something about white saves and armor, and actually I said this earlier about red saves as well. It's something about those saves after you roll your armor. They always just seem to crumble, and I don't know what it is, but it just feels weird. And again, that's not really like a compelling reason to not run a vehicle, but it is just something to be that I've noticed, at least in my games, is something about those saves after armor just seem to crumble. You can't rely on this being alive through the whole game if you play it quite aggressively. So one of the lists I ran earlier in the year was kind of a Veers AT-ST synergy list, where you can guidance the standby onto the AT-ST and kind of control a section of the board using that standby, because obviously vehicles can't be suppressed, they can't have the standby shut off. What I was finding, though, is my opponents would just kill the AT-ST and then they wouldn't have to worry about it. And the problem is, because those standbys are only range 2, most anti-armor stuff is going to be further than range 2, obviously unless it's, a force user or something trying to get closer. But, land speeders, AATs, I keep using those examples, but they can just bombard you from range. There's nothing you can really do about it. And again, losing actions on this does feel pretty rough. What I will say, at least, one thing going for Empire and Rebels is they do have cheap access to repair, and that does, I think, give a small buff just generally to their vehicles, because Gar and Separatists pay a real premium for fixing for that kind of repair. So it is something to note, is that you can, if you're planning to have a unit sit a bit further back, maybe you've got some, if you've got Snows with like Del Meeko or something, then firstly that's some repair on him, but also you can get some repairs through just the sort of upgrade to that unit. In terms of upgrades, I'm normally a Hammers believer, but Arsenal 4 Commander is also valid and can be really fun. Does require you to push up a bit more, but just something about running in and firing all 4 weapons at once does feel pretty fun. A bit of a nice suppression bomb as well. Assuming you hit with all of those, it would be 5 suppression, because one of those has suppression as well. But yeah, getting that surge to hit on what's normally going to be like a triple rainbow is pretty classic on the sort of dice pool there. It'll normally give you an extra hit or 2, which does feel really nice. And sometimes you just have those rolls where you get 4 surges, and it's like, yeah, well, definitely worth it now. So yeah, normally Hammers Pilot and sometimes Link Targeting Array if you need it, but it doesn't need too much stuff. And then it's coming in kind of 155, 160, which doesn't feel too bad. As I said, I would just like to see a little buff to it, nothing major. You could even do another little points drop down 5-10 points or something. I think it would probably be okay, but I'm fine with it where it is. And obviously you have to be a little bit careful, because if you make the ST, I'm not saying it's anywhere near being too strong, but if it was to become too strong, Tempest then could become a problem. So I understand why having it slightly on the weaker side in what's effectively a kind of quite fringe list, and one that is quite hard if you don't have the tech to play into. Maybe it's good that it's probably a little bit on the weaker side, as that might be a bit of a negative play experience. So ATST super fun, and I think just very consistent in what it will do in your games, but don't rely on those white health, those white saves to save you, because otherwise you'll have no ATST and then you're 160 points down. Moving up to the next unit in B tier, it's going to be the ISP. Now, I think a list with 2 ISPs in won the World Championship or something earlier in the year. And that, I think, kind of like thrust it onto everyone's radar a bit. I think nobody was really, at least that I was aware of, was kind of running it competitively. I think it was always a bit overlooked. But as somebody who's tried a bit of ISPs, I quite like them. They're a bit of a tricky unit to use, because they, again, it's that 7 health and that armor 3. It's a bit like the sort of the airspeeder. If you put them in the wrong spot, people are going to have the damage to get over the top and kill it. And yes, you've got cover 1, but don't rely on that to save you. And again, your weak point sort of sides and rear does mean that most people will be pushing an extra impact, because again, those sides and rear arcs are huge. But if what you want it to do is sit at the back, either with the beam gun or the anti-armor gun would be my suggestions. Thanks to that gunslinger especially, it does mean that you can sort of do quite consistent damage each turn. And if you can force 2 vehicles to make sort of 2 saves each, thanks to that 2 red impact 2 dice pool, it's not bad at all. Couple that with the fact that, especially in GAR, doesn't feel that overpriced. Like, I think you're paying 65 points to the base unit, and then normally you're probably running a pilot. Again, I'd guess either the shock trooper or the Star Corps elite armor pilot. And then normally you see the beam cannons quite a lot, but I think the missile pods were what was running the sort of world championship list. So again, like, that's coming in under 100 points. And I think, like I've said here, I think it does feel like a worse land speeder, because it's speed 3 rather than having speed 2 and speeder. And what's really good about the land speeder is that even if you're damaged or ioned, you still have the ability to move and shoot. If you have your ISP ioned or damaged, you then have to make the choice between moving and shooting, because you're only going to have one action. And I think that's one of the things that makes the land speeder just so good, is that action economy. But saying that this unit is a worse land speeder is sort of no shade on it at all, because I still think the land speeder, despite the recent nerf to the Astro, feels really strong. And I think, having played it in a couple of games, it's still absolutely doing land speeder things. So ISP feels pretty good to me. It also slots into the 212. Again, this is kind of less of an investment than the Saber tank. It's obviously a lot less tough and a lot less reliable. But if you don't quite have the points, or if you can't triple up on sabers, for instance, without knocking yourself down to like 8 or 9 acts, if you throw in an ISP or 2, it might just bump your acts up to like 10 or 11. And again, if you're running big vehicles, that can be huge, getting your activation count up a little bit, because it might just mean you get shot by one less thing, or maybe you get to shoot an AAT before it shoots you and things like that. Like, little things like that, just bumping the activation count up 1 or 2 can be absolutely massive. It's a solid unit, and don't be too aggressive with it. Don't throw it further forward than it needs to be. That speed 3 is nice, and in a pinch, it's got a big base. If you need to just go speed 3 across the board, you can do that, and it's absolutely valid. But yeah, it's a solid unit. If you've not given it a go, I think it's worth a go. I don't think it's like going to be like a meta-defining unit in most people's hands, but clearly it can be pretty effective. I think it did win a world championship. Next unit in B tier is going to be the Dark Troopers. And I think this might be an overreaction, but I'm going to initially stand by it, and then we'll see how the meta develops. I think the buffs to the Dark Troopers could make them significantly stronger. Couple that with the fact that Gideon also got buffed. In total, if you were running 3 Darks in Gideon, that list got about 50 to 60 points, I think, back. And that's a big deal. That's a huge deal, obviously, depending on how you're kitting your Darks, how many of you're running, etc. But That's a big deal, and it basically allows you to get an extra act. And given that Dark Troopers already, thanks to the fact their token goes in the bag twice, were able to have quite a significant number of activations for sort of relatively few units, there are darks lists that get to like, you can go triple darks with like 9 or 10 acts base, which effectively gets you to know 12 or 13 activations, which is kind of what most other lists are running, except you've got some big hulking units that are really difficult to stop. Yeah, I think there's something in there, and I played people who were running darks before, and they felt surprisingly good. I think I did maybe like underestimate them a bit before, but in the hands of people who know what they're doing, darks can be really scary. So yeah, I mean maybe this is a little bit of just PTSD from when they were so oppressive at the end of the last version of the game, but I think there is something in darks, and when you take some of the heavy weapons, when you got the assault cannon and even the Myrtleizer and things like that, like they can throw out some pretty serious damage, and getting to go twice is a really big deal. So we'll see. I haven't played any of them since the buff. I'm excited to run into some lists that do bring them, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah, that's all I have to say, really. It's kind of a gut instinct thing here. They might actually end up being a low A tier unit, to be honest, but I think in and around that B tier, I'm not expecting to be meta defining, but I am expecting them to be pretty good. So we'll see how that plays out. Final unit in B tier is going to be Aquadroids. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. I'm trying not to sound too smug. Yeah, they needed to be nerfed, and they were nerfed. They weren't nerfed in the best way possible. As I've said previously, I think in my reaction to the nerf video, I would have split the nerf between the basic unit and the heavy. I think now essentially you either take them with the heavy or you don't take them at all. I can't see a reason. I mean, most people did take the heavy anyway when they before they were nerfed, but now I think it's even more of an auto take. And I don't know, it's just not quite what I wanted to see. Like, I really like units where there's kind of multiple different ways of running them, like there are decisions to be made, and with Aquas it feels like the decision's been taken away. Saying that, for 106 points now, I think they feel fine. Yeah, I think that's already to say. I've kind of complained a lot about Aquas before, but essentially if you've not run into Aquas before, they're normally, if you're taking the heavy, there's sort of 4 big bases that are all of line of sight blocking, and you can kind of build like a wall across a section of your battlefield and then just hide whatever you want to hide behind it. Generally, people use it to hide force users or high value units that could then jump up the board and deal some damage later on. They still have 12 white health with armor 2, and it's still a lot to deal with, but thanks to the nerf, they feel less efficient, and that was the really key point, I think, about what made Aquas so strong, was a bit like I said with ATRTs in the last video. If something is just so efficient for its kind of toughness, especially if it can't be suppressed or panicked, then people are going to run it, and Aquas used to be this brilliant damage sponge for quite cheap. They're now less good in that role thanks to the nerf, so I think that's kind of toned them down sufficiently, but they're still not a bad unit, and I think it's really tricky in the Separatist heavy slot because, for my money, it's probably the most competitive slot in the game, and now I think Aquads have probably slid to the bottom of that. Not miles behind everything else, as we'll see in a second, but I think they are just at the bottom. They still have the infiltrate shenanigans on turn 1. Their dice pool with surge to hit, if you're taking the heavy as well, is normally good for about 4.5, which is, decent. But yeah, they're just toned down a bit, and I don't know. It's a tricky one with Aquas now, because it was always the case with Aquas that if you really focused them down, you could kill them. But it just never felt like it was worth it because they were so efficient for their points. Now that they've been nerfed, it does maybe feel a bit more like it's worth killing them because they are worth more points. And actually, with that armor 2 and the white saves, as long as you have big enough dice pools and you're not trying to do little chip bits of damage, you can actually sort of carve through them pretty quickly, and that does feel quite good. So a good nerf, a well-placed nerf. I just like to see it split across 2, the base unit and the heavy. But aside from that, if you want a fairly efficient, tough, heavy unit that maybe doesn't play the traditional role of a tank, but more as kind of like a blocking unit, Aquas are the unit for you. Moving up into A tier, and we're going to be talking about the Land Speeder. Now, worth noting, I think all the units in A tier are pretty much interchangeable, and a lot of it's just like list dependent, board dependent, and playstyle dependent. But for me, I think the Land Speeder is probably just the least consistent of the units that are in A tier. That doesn't mean it's the worst. I think Landspeeder is still fantastic. For me, best turn 1 unit in the game, I would say. I think the combination of speeder, aim, and a very consistent dice pool with excellent keywords into armor just makes it such a consistent threat. The other advantage that this unit has is that it's in the Rebel faction, which is probably the best faction in the game, maybe tied with Separatists, at spamming activations to be able to make your Landspeeders come on last. If your Landspeeder is coming on last, that means firstly, it doesn't have to be worried about being shot by another Landspeeder or an AAT or something, if you can get sort of above your opponent in terms of activations. The other thing it means is you get to shoot them back, and when you have Ion, if you can rob even one action from an AAT, people are going to be furious. Like, it's so infuriating when, you know, say you got a Saber or an AAT or a Snail Tank or something, like these big units. If you take one activation away from them, that's like they've paid so many points for this really expensive thing that needs to put in work. And then, again, because those units don't have speeder, well, unless you shot a land speeder, but if those units don't have access to speeder, they then might have to make the choice between moving and shooting, and that's such a difficult decision to make when you spent all these points on something with a massive gun that's meant to be shooting stuff. Be like, oh, I really have to move on to that objective, and that's why Ion is so strong. The other thing is, as I've just hinted there, the Landspeeder gets around Ion and being damaged, although if it's damaged, it's probably going to blow up because of its low health pool, but it gets around Ion by having access to Speeder. And that means even if you lose an action because of Ion, say you got shot by another Landspeeder, you're still going to be able to shoot and move, which is absolutely what you want to be doing. The other option you have is you'll still be able to move twice if you want to, and that's really effective. So yeah, the Landspeeder is still doing exactly what it's always done. Some people take HQ uplink. I'm personally a link targeting array believer, but you know, if you want that order control on turn 1, absolutely go for it. Personally, I think the Astro is now too expensive. I think they had a couple of options. I think they could have raised it a little bit and made it kind of semi-playable, but for me, they've killed the unit, and I think that's absolutely fine. I understand why playing into 2 Landspeeders, both with Astros, shooting 4 times on turn 1 and killing your AAT before it gets to do anything was frustrating, so I get why they've removed that from the game. I think it's absolutely fine. I think it also opens up more design space around the Landspeeder, so I think they can make other parts of the Landspeeder stronger or weaker if they want to, without worrying about that kind of double attack thing. I think it, again, lines up with quite a lot of what they've been doing recently with kind of simplifying things, so taking away, you know, the charge or relentless thing outside of your activation makes sense, or like, you know, the old standby sharing thing with clones. Again, I understand why they took that away. I think it does take away a bit of, you know, skill and stuff from the game, debatably, but I understand from a simplicity and a balance standpoint why they've done it. Also, the Landspeeder is now pretty cheap. You know, you're not running the Astro anymore, so I think it comes in about 104, 105. It has opened up the blaster rifle for 1 point being taken if you want to. That Arsenal 3 can be pretty chaotic. You know, you can split fire 3 ways, ion gun, rocket launcher, and then blasters out the side if you want to. Yeah, it's a great unit, and there's also something to be said for just naked Landspeeder, no stuff. I think it's 55 points base cost. If you just want to sprint across the board with armor 2, speeder, 6 health, cover 1, it's not the worst thing in the world. So there are valid options, but personally I'm still thinking like taking the rocket launcher and the ion gun still feels like the way to go for me. So Landspeeder is still doing what it's always done, just maybe now slightly less good, slightly less swingy than it used to be. Next unit is going to be the basic snail, so this is not the one in EXD. Yeah, it's just a big block that's going to sit in the middle of the board, and it's going to shoot stuff with its heavy blasters, and then it's probably taking, you know, high velocity shells or anti-armor shells or whatever. Like, you're probably taking one of those armament options. Access to defense protocols is the worst, but I understand why people run it. So for people who don't know, it gives you outmaneuver and nimble. So it means if you can get a dodge on this, it basically it's even better than armor 1. Like it's super armor basically. Like, it's always removing damage, and it is just something psychologically. I don't know what it does, but it's so damaging. Like, because armor is like a flat amount of stuff, getting over the top of it obviously requires either a big dice pool or certain keywords. the fact that the nimble works on both of those, so it works even if your armor's been bypassed, like unless they've got high velocity, which is an interesting sort of counterpoint that we did see. Like when EXD was really popular, people did start to bring things with high velocity, so AATs for instance, because you just ignored the sort of nimble and the outmaneuver, and it just forced sort of the snails to be rolling straight defense die rather than relying on those dodges to take that damage away. But yeah, these are just, Kalani's best friend is always the way I've described them. Like, pop 2 of these in the center of the board. They also have transport, which is great. Like, they're sort of, if you weren't running EXD, you could kind of do 2 B2s with the heavy and sometimes extra what's it called? Is it the Viper droid that you can add to it? I think, and then they had to change it because it could take the dice or something. Anyway, you could do like heavy and then put the Viper droid in there as well, and you could just transport that unit forward, which in and of itself was probably worth, like, you probably pay 5 or 10 points for the privilege of having that. And then you had just this really tough unit that, thanks to that, as I said, that outmaneuver and that nimble just felt incredibly frustrating to deal with. And yeah, it was just really consistent and hasn't been nerfed, hasn't been changed. I think as the power level of Legion will continue, I imagine, to creep up, it will start to feel less problematic. And especially if you're running, again, land speeders or something, like, there were ways to deal with this. And especially if you're relying on those white defense die, as I said, with the ATST, they can sometimes just drop really quickly and don't rely on those white defense die to save you. So yeah, it does what it says on the tin. It's really solid, it's efficient for its points, and it really suits that kind of supportive super attack droid that could just sit there, give it the stuff it needs. And it also has that surge to hit, which is really nice as well. Like on those big dice pools, having that native, not having to take an upgrade or anything to get that, is a really nice thing. So yeah, feels great. And final unit in A tier is going to be the AAT. Now, I was on the verge of putting this in S tier, and then I've played a couple of them actually since the change, and I've toned it down a little bit because I think in my head, when they changed the points, I was like, oh my god, it's going to be S tier now. The thing is, the AAT's weaknesses that it's always had still do exist, in that what the AAT does is it offers really consistent damage every turn. Like 4 red dice with critical 2, surge to hit, impact 2, high velocity. Always going to be incredibly consistent. Without an aim, you're normally pulling 3. With an aim, you're normally hitting 4. And it's just going to do that every turn. The problem is it doesn't have the high roll potential that some vehicles can offer. Like, it doesn't have the, those white and those black dice hanging around to kind of buff it up a little bit, like the land speeder does, for instance, or even the snail does, for instance. Like, it can offer those just absurd turns where you do high roll. And it does mean that the AAT can sometimes struggle to actually kill things. Like, it's always going to do really consistent damage, but it can struggle to have those kind of big turns that you kind of need to really wipe stuff out. And there's also less incentive to chuck like loads of aims and support elements onto this, because it, again, doesn't have the size of that sort of dice pool that's going to require those rerolls. So yeah, it just doesn't quite have that synergy with the kind of supportive units that would normally hang out near one of these units. It also doesn't have the sort of programming thing that snails can offer, so it doesn't get the outmaneuver, doesn't get the nimble, which I'm glad about because I'm really happy with that. But yeah, it's just very consistent, and basically it's just going to do the same thing every game. Like, it will move onto the board turn 1, and it will fire its main gun and high velocity shells. That's normally the way I would expect people to be running them, because you keep that high velocity if both the weapons have high velocity. So then I think that then ends up being 6 red and a white. 6 red and white with critical 3, which is very nice, although you probably won't hit that many surges. So yeah, it's just incredibly consistent, and that is, I think, for competitive players, that consistency is really useful, because being able to anticipate what a unit is going to do and then making your plans on the basis of that is really valuable. And when you have really consistent dice pools, that is super useful. As I said though, I just doesn't quite have the strength of synergy that the snails do, which is why I've kind of put them on the kind of same kind of level here. Also, barrage is really useful. Like, on that turn where you need to cycle your high velocity shells back, you can then just go 4 red, and that feels really good. It does require your entire turn, which it obviously isn't great, but generally on turn 1 you can position yourself where you want to be, and that's really useful. The other problem that this unit faces, as I've said previously, is that separatists do struggle a little bit for access to cheap repair. So what this means is that this becomes a phenomenal ion target. And even taking away one of its actions, so like for instance, even if you get one ion on it, on a turn you're planning to barrage, it takes away one whole attack, which is just so annoying to deal with. So it is extremely good, but I don't think it's quite as S tier game breaking as I was anticipating it being, and maybe overreacted a little bit, but still very good, and I'm still expecting it to be a real part of the competitive meta going forward, but we shall see how it pans out. And the final unit, which is going to be in S tier, is going to be the EXD Snail. Essentially, it's just a little bit better than the regular Snail, and that's just about enough for me to drop it into S tier. So the key advantages it has over its sort of counterpart is that it's Arsenal 3, which is great, especially when your opponent's getting closer to you. That can just be so nice to have hanging around. The other thing it offers is Direct Trooper unit, which is also amazing, like so useful, especially in EXD, where maybe your order control isn't quite as strong as it might be in sort of regular Separatists. That's really nice, a really good thing to have hanging around. And the final thing it can offer is just the absolute carnage that EXD special rules can bring. Getting the extra aims, getting the additional dice on the heavy blasters and things like that can just make it feel super strong. As I said previously, I think a lot of what I said about the Snail previously applies to this as well. It is Kalani's best friend, and again, you can get that programmed, you can get those dodges going, it just feels really good. Yeah, it's just a really strong unit, and while the slight disadvantage is a lot of your stuff is fixed front, as long as you sit kind of far enough back and almost let people come to you, that can let you pick your targets, and when you've got reposition, that's just really strong to have hanging around as well, and it lets you, as I've said here, you know, you can do your suppression bombs with your Arsenal 3, or you can really focus fire on sort of one particular target, and that feels really good. So yeah, it's just a slightly better version of the Snail, essentially. I don't think it's way better than its sort of counterpart, and it does lose Surge to hit, which isn't great, but fortunately its heavy blasters do get access to critical 1 base, which is quite nice, and generally will kind of rescue any surges that you do pull, but it is worth noting that Surge hit can be a little bit of a loss sometimes. But yeah, mainly just for the EXD shenanigans, the Arsenal 3 and the Direct Trooper unit, I think it just raises up one tier above its sort of regular counterpart. But not an OP unit at all. I'm not saying it needs a nerf or anything like that. I'm just saying I think it is very strong and very consistent when it is dropped into EXD. So yeah, there we go. There's the heavy slot tier list. I think, to be fair, the heavy slot, I think overall is fairly balanced. I think Separatists by far have the best of them. I think I've given them 4 of the top 5, and I think that's not actually particularly biased even. I think you can make an argument for maybe Aquas even being slightly higher if you wanted to, but yeah, feels really good, and I'm really happy with the way vehicles feel in the game at the moment. I think they feel like an investment, but most of them are correctly balanced. As ever, Empire does seem to have got kind of the roughest end of things, and Guard to an extent as well, so maybe a couple little buffs would be nice, but I think overall a pretty well balanced slot. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, subscribe, etc., and I will see you for the next one.